the deer panteth for the water, so my soul longs after thee. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship thee. You alone are my strength, my shield. To you alone may my spirit yield. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship thee.
Hello dear friends. Till now we have been reflecting on the first book of Samuel, and now we see Saul was the first king. He was anointed by Samuel, and when he failed to be faithful to Yahweh and turned out to be disobedient and rebellious, God rejected him. And now God asked Samuel to anoint David as the king. Even though he was anointed, we see many years have passed, but David is not yet the king of the land. Saul was not ready to forsake the throne. He held on to it, and he wanted to destroy David to finish him off. But by God's grace, we find David was able to go forward. And as we go through the entire story, we find David is guided by the Lord in all that he did, whereas Saul was losing the protection, the guidance of God step by step. And whatever Saul lost, David was gaining on the other hand. In this encounter between Saul and David, we can say, when David began as a shepherd boy or a musician, he grew in stature very soon. But then he went down the steps, we can say, and came to the status of a dacoit chief even. But later, gradually, he ascends the steps, and we can see that he regained power and position. And finally, he becomes practically a small king of Ziklag with an army, maybe around 600 or still more, we do not know. But whatever it be, we can say that David has his descents and ascents the same way. He needed time to assert himself again against Saul. And the good side of David is also exposed here. Even when he got opportunities to destroy Saul, he did not do that, and he did not allow his men to do that. And thus, David was always beloved to Yahweh, keeping up the principles of justice and righteousness, and honoring God's anointed ones. He honored and respected the priests. He protected them, whereas David was standing against them and killing them. And Therefore, we find as we go through the chapters, David was improving his position, but it took time. That's what we can say. And now the things are coming to a close, we can think. David's enemies are done away with one by one. But it was not he who did it at all. Everything moved in favor of David, we can say. Thus, we find David was preferred by Yahweh much more than Saul himself. That's what we can say. And in chapter 28, we had seen David had gone for divination. This phenomenon of divination, it is narrated here. That does not mean we can do it. What does it mean? It is narrated here because that is what happened in history. And what does it imply? When somebody is deprived of the means to approach God, he may try even to go to the opposite side, to befriend oneself with the evil. And that is what he did. He wanted to get to know what will happen in the war. And it means we can do the same. No, we cannot do that. It is the most serious sin amounting to apostasy, we know. And therefore, the lesson of the story is clear therefore. And what's the lesson of the story? When somebody is deprived of the means to know the will of God, they may resort to just the opposite even. We should take care that we do not fall into such a situation. And in the same way, we had already analyzed about harem. And there are people who would say, can we also do that or practice it to settle accounts with the enemy? No, never. Why? Because as we have seen, Christ in the New Testament has rewritten the imperfect laws of the Old Testament. It is not that the laws of the Old Testament were wrong, but only imperfect. And that is why, if you remember what we said about the Sermon on the Mount, Christ is rewriting the laws. 10 or 11 cases are narrated there. You have heard it said, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, life for life. But I say to you, you have heard it said, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. But I say to you. Thus, the imperfect laws of the Old Testament was rewritten by Christ. And what is the sum total of the New Testament teaching? Love God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength. And love your neighbor as you love yourself or as you love God. Therefore, both are given importance. And hence, it would mean that the practices like harem has no meaning in New Testament. But in those times, it was permitted, it was needed in a way, because that was the practice of the time. And that does not mean we can do the same here. And in chapter 31, we find Saul committed suicide. Again, we are to think. Suicide is not the answer to any problem. Always we are to think that there will be somebody coming to help us in our dire needs. Think of what happened at Cana, at the marriage feast. they had no wine. But unexpectedly, they received the help from Mother Mary. She was instrumental for bringing in new wine. We know the story. The same way, there will be somebody coming to our help. Hence, we are not to lose our hope, but stand firm in our trust and rely on Yahweh or rely on God. God will help us, God will strengthen us. And that is the important message that we can say when we reflect on the first book of Samuel. Okay, now we go to the second book of Samuel. And there, in the first 3-4 chapters, we find the civil war going between David's men and the army of Saul, or army of the son of Saul, we can say. In chapter 1, we will find the report about the death of Saul and his sons reach David, and what the men of Jabesh Gilead had done. They took their bodies and buried them in a noble way, and thus repaid Saul, since Saul had saved their honor some times back. And therefore, David now sends word to the people of Jabesh Gilead, appreciating them for what they did. And David is now in Hebron, and when the king of Israel is dead, they are without a king for the time being. And for fear of Philistines, Abner, the military chief of Saul, they led the army away from Jordan area and took them to the other side of Jordan, and he installed the son of Saul called Ishbaal to be the king of the land. And he became king in a town called Mahanaim in Transjordan, or the other side of Jordan. Thus Israelites have a new king now. But the people of Judah, the tribe of David, what did they do? They came to David and said, "We know that you were ordained, or you were anointed king over Israel. And since Saul is dead now, come and be our king." And they were ready to accept him as king. And thus David becomes the king of Judah alone. Therefore, only one tribe is there, and he becomes the king of Judah. And he began to rule from Hebron. And that is the story we find in chapter 1. And when the news of the death of Saul and his sons, especially that of Jonathan, remember the story that David was so closely associated with Jonathan. They had made a covenant, and we know all the stories. And when they were dead, David was lamenting over death, and he was singing an elegy over them, and therefore expressing his sorrow and also honoring the great heroes, Saul and Jonathan. The mourning on the elegy that was done by David, practically it was giving out a lesson for the people of Israel. Even when David was hated by Saul, and Saul was always chasing him to kill him, but David repays with what is good. He mourns for them rather than being joyful at the death of King Saul. And this is the difference between Saul and David. David was such a nice man and always trying to do good for others and never be ready to lay hand on God's anointed ones. And therefore we can see the great contrast between David and Saul. And in chapter 1 we find all these things. And there is still another story. A person came to David saying that he was the one who killed Saul and his sons. They were lying wounded, and when he was going through the war field, he came across them and he killed them. And that was a story narrated by him. And David killed the one who claimed to have killed Saul, asking him, "Who gave you the power to lay hand on the anointed one of Yahweh?" And therefore he was giving out a message to whoever lays hands on God's anointed will be given the capital punishment. Okay, therefore these are the important stories we can see. And in chapter 2, David, when the people of Judah comes to him and ask him to be the king, from Ziklag, David moves to Hebron. And that was a city where David was ruling, where Saul was ruling. And he became king of Judah in Hebron. But others or other tribes, they had the son of Saul by name Ishbal as their king, and he was the king in Mahanaim. And we find an interesting thing here. The son of Saul was called originally Ishbal, but the biblical editors who came later, they changed the name to Ishbosheth. And why? Bosheth means shame. Ish means master. And therefore, Ish means the men. And Ishbal would mean the Lord of men. That was the original name. But later we find the authors changed that name to Ishbosheth, and it would mean a shame for men. But of course in our text the original name is kept up, Ishbal. And in chapter 2 we find the Abner is the military chief of Ishbal, and Joab the military chief of David. And the armies of both are engaging themselves in a war, and that is a story narrated in chapter 2. And here we find there is a war between select groups, 12 from the side of David and 12 from the side of Saul. They were asked to fight with each other, but all the 24 fell down dead, and hence the war was not conclusive, we can say. And then we find the servants of David and Ishbal, they made a treaty and they were ready to come forward to join with David. But of course Ishbal was there. And we will see in chapter 3, they were growing in their enmity on one side. And when David was ready to accept the people of Israel, their leaders, he was ready to make a treaty with them. And Abner was the military chief, we know. But now Joab practically got offended. Maybe that he thought Abner may be made the military chief if they come to David's fold. And therefore, Joab treacherously killed Abner. At that time, Abner was innocent. He had come to settle the terms with David. And when he was returning, Joab said, "Okay, please come. I have to talk with you in private," and then killed him. And David was weeping like anything at the death of Abner too. And when he was crying, people of Israel understood that David had nothing to do with it. And that is what we will see. And therefore, this is the way that we will be able to understand how the matters developed. And finally, we will find David was able to make the people of Israel and his own people go together. But that still needed some more time, we can say. In chapter 3, we find Abner is killed by Joab, and then David's mourning for Abner, and people were satisfied with David because they come to see that David was lamenting over Abner. Therefore, the people of Israel also began to side with David, we can say. But of course, they have their king, Ishbaal, still over them. And at this time, there is something that took place. Why Abner wanted to come to the fold of David? There was a quarrel that developed between Abner, the military chief of Ishbaal, the son of Saul, and Abner. That is, there was a concubine of Saul, and naturally we know Ishbaal had taken for himself the concubine of Saul. And there's a reason for that. Usually, when there is no direct son to be the heir to the throne, the wife of the king or the daughter of the king who is married to another one, such a person also has a claim to the throne. That is, when David married Michal, the daughter of Saul, David has a right to the throne of Israel. When there is no son left to Saul, we can say, then the daughter or the one who have married the daughter will have a claim. The same way, when a king dies and whoever has takes the concubine has a claim to the throne. And therefore, when Ishbaal found fault with Abner, saying that you are taking hold of the concubine of Saul, thereby you are trying to assert yourself as the king of the land. And Abner got angry with Ishbaal, and that is the reason why he defected to the opposite side. And now Ishmael comes to here, and we see when Ishmael comes to, when Abner comes to the camp of David, David may have made some words of treaty with him, but we do not know what the terms were. But Joab got angry at this and treacherously killed Abner. Therefore, all this story we will see is narrated here. That's what we can say. And therefore, as the things go forward, we will see this is how the story developed. And in chapter 4, we find there is the Ishmael was there, and when he was sleeping on his bed, two of his servants killed him, and they came to David to inform that they had killed the king. And David killed the informants, while he said, no one should lay hands on God's anointed one. The kings are the anointed ones. Therefore, they were also given the capital punishment by David, you can see. Thus, Ishmael also is dead. And at that time, we find the people of Israel, they come to David saying, we know you are the one authorized to be our king, entitled to be our king, because we know you are anointed by the Lord. And therefore, now let us make a treaty. And he was ready for that. The people, having made a treaty with David, came up and accepted David as their king too. And thus we can see David becomes the king of Judah as well as the king of Israel. Therefore, practically, even though it is Israel is just one, but there is a separation that has come up here. The tribe of Judah on one side and other tribes on the other side. And this is the story that we find here with regard to the rise of David as the king of the land. And thus David becomes the only king of both Judah and also of other tribes. And we will see the kingdom will begin to grow, both in power and also in extent. And that is the story that we will find in coming chapters. And there we will find all these things. And besides, we can also say that as the history goes forward, David was able to establish his kingdom and make it all the more powerful, and the steps to reform and to strengthen the kingdom were taken by him. Okay, hereby we conclude this session, and tomorrow we will continue with the next session. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Lord, for the gift and love of your sacred word. Open our hearts to put into practice that which you have revealed to us through your word. Amen.